"No lawyer. You're finished," my brother said loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. A few people chuckled. My father smiled. Their attorney leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had already decided how the day would end. I stood alone at the defense table. No lawyer, no family beside me, no one whispering encouragement in my ear. Then the judge opened a thick folder and stared at the first page. His expression changed. The courtroom grew quiet. He turned another page, and another. Suddenly their attorney stood up. "What is it?" my brother asked with a grin. The man didn't answer. Instead, he looked directly at me. His face had gone pale. Oh my God. The words slipped out before he could stop them. My father frowned. "What?" The attorney swallowed hard. "Look at her file." The judge slowly removed his glasses. Then he said the sentence that would destroy everything my family believed about me. "She doesn't need a lawyer." 5 seconds later, my father's body collapsed toward the floor. But to understand why that happened, you need to understand what kind of family I came from. My name is Emily Carter. At the time of these events, I was 32 years old and a commissioned officer in the United States Army. Most people who met me for the first time saw a calm woman with a controlled voice and careful posture. They saw someone polite, disciplined, and quiet. What they didn't see were the years that created that silence. I grew up in a small town in Ohio with my father, my mother, and my older brother, Jason. In our house, there was one simple rule. Jason mattered. I didn't. Nobody ever said those exact words. They didn't have to. You learn things through repetition. Jason forgot to do his chores. He was tired. I forgot to do mine. I was irresponsible. Jason got a C on a test. School wasn't for everyone. I got an A-. Why wasn't it an A? The older I became, the clearer the pattern became. My father worshipped my brother. He called him his legacy, his future, the son who would carry the family name. I was simply the daughter, the backup child, the one expected to help without being noticed. My mother wasn't cruel. She was simply tired. Years of trying to keep peace in the house had worn her down. When my father criticized me, she would lower her eyes and say nothing. At 12 years old, I stopped expecting her to defend me. At 16, I stopped asking. The only person who ever truly saw me was my grandfather, Colonel William Carter, retired Army officer, Vietnam veteran, a man who rarely raised his voice because he never needed to. He had a way of looking at people that made them tell the truth. When I was 13, he found me sitting alone behind his garage after my father had spent 20 minutes explaining why my brother deserved a new truck, and I didn't deserve a scholarship celebration dinner. Grandpa sat beside me and handed me a bottle of root beer. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, he said, "You know why they're wrong about you?" I shrugged. He smiled. "Because they're measuring you with the wrong ruler." I never forgot that sentence. When I turned 18, I enlisted. My father hated the decision. "You're throwing your life away. You'll quit in 6 months. You don't belong in the military." I remember standing in the kitchen listening to him. Then I remember my grandfather quietly standing up from the table. "Funny," Grandpa said. "What? You said the same thing about me." The room became silent. That was the first time I ever saw my father lose an argument. The Army changed my life. Not because it was easy, because it wasn't. Basic training was brutal. The deployments were harder. The sacrifices were endless. But for the first time in my life, effort mattered. Results mattered. Discipline mattered. Nobody cared whether I was someone's daughter. Nobody cared whether my father approved of me. The uniform didn't care. The mission didn't care. And I loved that. Over the next decade, I built a career. Promotions came. Awards came. Responsibilities grew. My father barely acknowledged any of it. When I became an officer, he changed the subject. When I received commendations, he talked about Jason. When I bought my first house, he asked why I wasn't married. Jason, meanwhile, bounced between failed business ventures, failed investments, failed relationships. Each time he fell, my father rushed to rescue him. Money, excuses, second chances, third chances, 10th chances. The pattern never changed. Then my mother passed away after a sudden illness. That loss fractured whatever remained of our family. My father became more bitter. Jason became more entitled. And Grandpa became my anchor. I called him every Sunday. Sometimes we'd talk about military history. Sometimes baseball. Sometimes nothing important at all. Those conversations became precious, especially because I knew they wouldn't last forever. 3 years later, I got the call. Grandpa had suffered a stroke. By the time I arrived at the hospital, he was conscious but weak. I sat beside his bed for hours. At one point, he squeezed my hand. "Still carrying the family on your back." I laughed through tears. Trying. He smiled. Good. That was the last real conversation we ever had. 2 weeks later, he passed away. The funeral brought everyone together. At least physically. Emotionally, we were miles apart. Jason spent most of the service checking his phone. My father accepted condolences like a politician greeting voters. I stood beside the casket and remembered the only man who had ever believed in me before I believed in myself. A week later, we gathered for the reading of the will. The attorney began calmly. A few personal items, some charitable donations, family keepsakes. Then everything changed. The largest asset in Grandpa's estate was a substantial investment portfolio and several properties accumulated over decades, worth millions, far more than anyone expected. The attorney adjusted his glasses. Then he read Grandpa's decision. The majority would go to me. Not Jason. Not my father. Me. The room froze. Jason actually laughed. He thought it was a joke. Then he realized it wasn't. My father's face turned red. What? The attorney repeated himself. Jason stood up. This is ridiculous. My father pointed at me. You manipulated him. The accusation hit the room like a gunshot. I stared at him. You don't actually believe that. Oh, I do. The attorney attempted to calm everyone. It didn't work. By the time the meeting ended, my father and brother were already discussing legal action. 3 weeks later, they filed suit. They claimed undue influence, manipulation, fraud. They wanted the will invalidated. They wanted everything. And they believed they would get it. Because for the first time in their lives, they were about to discover something they had never bothered learning about me. I informed the court that I would represent myself. When my father heard that, he laughed. Jason laughed even harder. And as we entered the courthouse on the first morning of trial, he leaned toward me with a smile. No lawyer. He shook his head. You're finished. The morning of the trial felt strangely ordinary. The sky above the courthouse was gray. A light wind pushed fallen leaves across the parking lot. People hurried through the entrance carrying coffee cups and briefcases, as if this were just another workday. For them, it probably was. For me, it was the day my family intended to erase everything my grandfather had chosen to leave behind. I parked my car, sat quietly for a moment, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked calm. Years in uniform had taught me something valuable. Fear and confidence often looked exactly the same from the outside. The difference existed only inside your head. I gathered my documents, stepped out of the vehicle, and walked toward the courthouse. My father's truck was already there. So was Jason's luxury SUV, the one he definitely couldn't afford. As I entered the building, I spotted them immediately. Jason stood beside a tall man in an expensive suit. Richard Lawson, one of the most successful probate attorneys in the state. His hourly rate alone was higher than many people earned in a week. Jason noticed me first. A grin spread across his face. Well, look who's here. My father turned. Neither of them greeted me. Neither of them asked how I was doing. Neither of them acted like I was family. At this point, I didn't expect them to. Lawson looked me over. Professional. Polite. Confident. Ms. Carter, he said. Mr. Lawson, I understand you've chosen to represent yourself. I have. He nodded. There was a brief pause. The kind people use when they're deciding how much honesty is appropriate. Finally, he said, that is certainly your right. Translation. You're making a terrible mistake. I almost smiled. Instead, I simply said thank you. Jason laughed. You hear that? Even he thinks you're crazy. I ignored him. Years ago, comments like that would have hurt. Not anymore. The courtroom filled slowly. By 9 o'clock, nearly every seat was occupied. Some people were curious. Others were connected to the estate. A few were simply waiting for their own cases. Still, I could feel eyes following me. People notice when one side has a high-powered attorney and the other side has nobody. Or at least that's what they thought. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood. Judge Harold Bennett entered. I had researched him extensively. Former prosecutor. Military family. Known for being fair but exceptionally difficult to fool. He settled into his chair and reviewed several documents before looking up. The proceedings began. Richard Lawson immediately took control of the room. He was good. Very good. His voice carried authority without sounding aggressive. His questions seemed reasonable. His arguments sounded logical. Watching him work, I understood why my father had hired him. Lawson's strategy became obvious almost immediately. He wasn't trying to prove that my grandfather had been incompetent. That would have been difficult. Instead, he intended to convince the court that I had influenced an elderly man during a vulnerable period of his life, a much easier argument. especially because I had spoken with Grandpa frequently during his final years. The first witness was one of Grandpa's neighbors, an elderly woman who had known him for decades. Lawson guided her carefully. Did Emily visit often? Yes. More often than the other family members. Yes. Would you say they were close? Very close. Lawson nodded thoughtfully. Did Mr. Carter ever discuss changing his will? The woman hesitated. A few times, after Emily's visits became more frequent. Yes. Lawson allowed silence to linger. The implication hung in the air. He didn't need to say it. Everyone understood what he wanted them to think. The second witness was a family acquaintance. Then another. And another. Each testimony was subtle. Nothing dramatic. Nothing explosive. Just enough small pieces arranged into a larger picture. Emily spent time with Grandpa. Emily called Grandpa. Emily visited Grandpa. Emily was close to Grandpa. Therefore, Emily must have manipulated Grandpa. It was clever, and if I hadn't known the full truth, I might have found it convincing myself. During cross-examination, I asked only a few questions. Short questions. Simple questions. Then I sat down. That surprised people. I could feel it. Most self-represented litigants talked too much, argued too much, panicked too much. I did none of those things. I listened. I took notes. I waited. By lunchtime, my father looked pleased. Jason looked ecstatic. He leaned back in his chair like a man already spending money he hadn't won yet. When the judge called for a recess, Jason practically bounced out of his seat. Outside the courtroom, I found a quiet bench near a window overlooking the city. I opened a bottle of water and reviewed my notes. A shadow appeared beside me. Judge Bennett. For a moment, I thought he was simply passing by. Instead, he stopped. Ms. Carter. I stood. Your Honor. He studied me carefully, not suspiciously. Curiously? May I ask you a question? Of course. His gaze remained fixed on me. Why are you representing yourself? The question wasn't hostile. It sounded genuine. I considered my answer. There are several reasons, such as, I thought about saying the obvious, that attorneys were expensive, that the estate shouldn't be drained by legal fees, that I knew the facts better than anyone. But none of those were the real answer, so I told him the truth. Because this isn't really about money. His eyebrow lifted slightly. No, sir. I looked through the window toward the parking lot. My father and brother have spent my entire life telling me who I am. The judge remained silent. They never listened when I spoke. I turned back toward him. This time they're going to have to. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then Judge Bennett nodded once. A very small movement, but something about it felt significant. He glanced down at the file tucked beneath his arm. A thick file. My file. I noticed several pages marked with colored tabs. His expression changed slightly, as though he had remembered something, or noticed something. Then he looked back at me. You seem remarkably calm. I smiled faintly. Occupational hazard. That earned the smallest hint of amusement. Indeed. The bailiff called everyone back inside. The judge paused before walking away. Then he said something that stayed with me. Courtrooms have a way of revealing things people work very hard to hide. I watched him return to the bench. At the time, I thought he was talking about my father. I would soon discover he wasn't. The afternoon session began. Lawson intensified his attack. He introduced financial records, phone logs, travel records, every document designed to suggest influence, every exhibit carefully chosen. My father watched with satisfaction. Jason barely concealed his excitement. Finally, near the end of the day, Lawson delivered what he clearly considered his strongest argument. He approached the center of the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, this case is not complicated. He turned toward me. An elderly man changed the distribution of a multi-million-dollar estate. Pause. The primary beneficiary was the family member who spent the most time with him. Another pause. And that beneficiary now sits alone at that table. His eyes moved deliberately across the room. No legal counsel. No professional representation. No independent verification of her claims. He spread his hands. The gesture practically screamed victory. Then he sat down. The courtroom fell silent. I looked across the room. Jason met my eyes. The grin returned. Slow. Arrogant. Cruel. Then he leaned toward me and spoke softly enough that only a few nearby people could hear. No lawyer, he chuckled. You're finished. What neither he nor my father noticed was the judge. Because at that exact moment, Judge Bennett wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my personnel file. And the expression on his face had completely changed. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse 20 minutes early. Old habits die hard. In the army, being on time meant arriving before everyone else. Anything less was late. The hallway outside Courtroom 3 was nearly empty. A janitor pushed a cart past the entrance. A clerk carried a stack of files toward another office. Everything felt calm, ordinary, almost peaceful. It was difficult to believe that within an hour my entire family would begin unraveling. I sat quietly at the defense table and organized my documents. When my father and Jason entered, they looked energized, confident. The previous day had gone exactly the way they wanted. Their witnesses had performed well. Their attorney had controlled the room, and I had spent most of the proceedings listening instead of fighting back. To them, silence looked like weakness. That misunderstanding would become very expensive. Jason dropped into his chair and smirked. "Sleep okay?" I didn't answer. "Probably not." My father laughed softly, reality finally setting in. Still, I said nothing. Years earlier, their comments would have pulled me into an argument. Now they simply sounded familiar. Predictable. People reveal a great deal when they think they've already won. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Bennett entered. Everyone stood. Then everyone sat. Something immediately felt different. The judge wasn't carrying the same file from yesterday. He was carrying two. One was the estate case. The other was much thicker. I recognized it instantly. My personnel record. Not the public version. The complete version. A file that contained years of evaluations, certifications, commendations, educational records, and government documentation. My pulse quickened slightly. Not from fear. From realization. The judge had done his homework. Across the aisle, Lawson seemed to notice the file as well. His expression tightened for a fraction of a second. Then the proceedings began. Lawson stood. "Your Honor, before we proceed, the plaintiffs respectfully move for summary consideration regarding several evidentiary matters." The judge nodded. "Go ahead." Lawson launched into a carefully prepared argument. He spoke for nearly 15 minutes. Every sentence reinforced the same idea. Emily Carter had influenced an elderly man. Emily Carter had benefited from that influence. Emily Carter had no legal basis to challenge the evidence presented. When he finished, he looked satisfied. The room remained silent. Then Judge Bennett turned toward me. "Ms. Carter." "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you wish to respond?" I stood. "Briefly." "Proceed." I walked toward the podium. No notes. No prepared speech. Just facts. Over the years, I had testified in military proceedings, administrative hearings, investigative reviews, and command inquiries. The setting was different. The pressure wasn't. For 10 minutes, I addressed each claim. Directly. Methodically. Without emotion. When I finished, I returned to my seat. Lawson appeared unimpressed. Jason looked amused. My father looked relieved. Then the judge began reviewing documents, one by one. The courtroom waited. 30 seconds passed. Then 60. Then 90. Finally, Judge Bennett removed his glasses. "Mr. Lawson." The attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge tapped the thick personnel file. "What exactly is your position regarding Ms. Carter's ability to represent herself?" Lawson hesitated. The question seemed to surprise him. "My position?" "Yes." Lawson adjusted his jacket. "I believe self-representation places her at a significant disadvantage." The judge nodded slowly. "I see." Then he opened the file. The sound echoed through the quiet room. One page, then another, then another. His eyes moved steadily down the documents. Suddenly, he looked toward the plaintiff's table. "She doesn't need a lawyer." The sentence landed like a hammer. Nobody moved. For a moment, I honestly thought people hadn't heard him. Then Jason blinked. "What?" My father frowned. Lawson stared at the judge. "Your Honor," Judge Bennett continued reading. "She possesses extensive legal training." Silence. The judge turned another page. "She has completed advanced military legal education." Another page. "She has participated in federal investigations involving financial misconduct." Another page. "She has testified under oath in numerous official proceedings." The room was completely still now. Even the spectators had stopped shifting in their seats. Then the judge looked directly at Lawson. "According to this file, Ms. Carter has spent years handling matters more complex than this probate dispute." I saw something happen in Lawson's face, not fear. Recognition. The sudden realization that he had misjudged someone. He reached for the copy of my record provided to counsel. His eyes moved rapidly. Faster. Then slower. Then he froze. His face lost color. Literally, the man looked pale. Oh my God. He hadn't meant to say it aloud. The word simply escaped. Jason turned toward him. What? No answer. What is it? Lawson looked at him, then at me, then back at the file. Look at her record. My father leaned forward, confused, annoyed. What record? The attorney swallowed. I could almost see him recalculating the entire case. Every assumption, every strategy, every prediction, gone. Because for the first time he wasn't looking at me as someone's daughter. He was looking at my professional history. And it told a very different story. The judge continued. Counsel, I suggest you proceed with the understanding that Ms. Carter is fully capable of representing herself. Yes, Your Honor. The confidence was gone from Lawson's voice. Not entirely, but enough, Jason noticed. So did my father. And neither understood why. The proceedings resumed. This time, however, everything felt different. The illusion had cracked. The image my family had built of me over decades was beginning to collapse. The next witness took the stand. One of the neighbors who had testified the previous day. Lawson conducted direct examination. Then the judge turned to me. Cross-examination. I stood. The witness smiled nervously. I approached slowly. Mrs. Reynolds, you testified yesterday that my grandfather discussed changing his will after my visits became more frequent. Correct? Yes. You're certain? Yes. I nodded. Can you tell the court when those conversations occurred? She gave several approximate dates. I waited. Then I opened a folder. Mrs. Reynolds, do you know where I was on those dates? She hesitated. Number. I handed a document to the bailiff. Military travel orders. Official records. The judge reviewed them. Then Lawson reviewed them. Then the witness reviewed them. On every date she had mentioned I was deployed overseas. Thousands of miles away. The woman stared at the paper. Confused. Embarrassed. I must have remembered wrong. You must have. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Small, but noticeable. I continued. Did my grandfather ever tell you I pressured him? Number. Did you ever witness me pressure him? Number. Did he ever seem afraid of me? Number. Then your testimony is based entirely on assumptions. The witness looked down. Yes. Thank you. I returned to my seat. The damage was immediate. One witness. 5 minutes. Years of assumptions destroyed. Jason no longer looked relaxed. My father shifted uncomfortably. Lawson rubbed his forehead. And for the first time since the lawsuit began, I saw doubt. Real doubt. Not in the courtroom. In my family's eyes. Because they were finally beginning to understand something my grandfather had known all along. I wasn't the weak daughter they remembered. I wasn't the quiet little girl they ignored at family dinners. I wasn't the forgotten child sitting alone behind Grandpa's garage. I had spent more than a decade learning how to analyze evidence, expose inconsistencies, and remain calm under pressure. And now those skills were aimed directly at them. The next witness was already being sworn in. I opened my notebook, picked up my pen, and prepared to dismantle the next lie. Something changed after Mrs. Reynolds left the witness stand. It wasn't dramatic. No one stood up and announced that my father and brother were losing. No headlines appeared. No sudden confession shook the courtroom. The change was subtler than that. People stopped looking at me like a victim. They started looking at me like a threat. And for the first time since the lawsuit began, Jason looked nervous. Not scared. Not yet. But nervous. The next witness was a former family friend named Robert Henson. He had known my grandfather for nearly 15 years. The day before, he had provided testimony suggesting that Grandpa seemed isolated during the last years of his life. The implication was obvious. An isolated elderly man is easier to manipulate. Lawson led him through direct examination. The testimony sounded convincing, at least on the surface. Then Judge Bennett turned toward me. Ms. Carter. I stood. Thank you, Your Honor. As I approached the witness stand, I noticed Robert avoiding eye contact. Interesting. People who tell the truth usually look at you. People who are afraid of being caught often look everywhere else. I stopped a few feet away. Mr. Henson, how many times did you visit my grandfather during the final year of his life? Several. Several? Yes. Can you be more specific? He hesitated. 5 or 6 times. I opened a folder. Would seeing your visitor log refresh your memory? His eyes widened slightly. The nursing facility maintained detailed records. Every visitor, every date, every arrival, every departure. The document was handed to him. He reviewed it. Silence. Then more silence. Finally, he cleared his throat. Perhaps fewer than I remembered. How many? Twice. A few heads turned in the audience. I continued. Did either visit last more than 20 minutes? Number. Did you speak with him regularly by phone? Number. Did you have access to his medical records? Number. Then how did you determine he was isolated? The witness swallowed. I assumed. The same word again. Assumed. I let it hang in the air. Then I returned to my seat. Another witness weakened. Another piece removed. Another crack spreading through their case. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt entirely different from the first day. Lawson was still skilled, still professional, but he no longer controlled the room. Now he was reacting, defending, adjusting, trying to contain damage. And the damage kept growing. Then came the turning point. The moment everything truly began falling apart. I requested permission to introduce evidence. Judge Bennett nodded. Proceed. I carried several folders to the evidence table. Jason frowned. My father looked irritated. Lawson looked concerned. The first item was security footage from the assisted living facility where Grandpa spent part of his final year. Months earlier, I had obtained the recordings legally during discovery. The footage appeared on the courtroom screen. The timestamp rolled. Grandpa walked through a hallway, slowly, but steadily. He greeted staff members, held conversations, read documents, signed paperwork, discussed financial matters, asked questions, corrected mistakes, made decisions. Nothing about him suggested confusion. Nothing suggested incompetence. Nothing suggested vulnerability. For nearly 20 minutes the footage played. The judge watched carefully. The spectators watched carefully. Most importantly, the witnesses watched carefully. The image being presented by my father's side was collapsing frame by frame. When the video ended, I stood. Your Honor, the plaintiffs repeatedly implied that my grandfather lacked the mental capacity to make independent decisions. I paused. The evidence shows otherwise. Judge Bennett nodded. Agreed. Jason's jaw tightened. The next exhibit was worse. Much worse. Financial records. Years of them. Bank statements. Transfers. Loans. Withdrawals. Checks. Every transaction had been organized chronologically, meticulously. The projector displayed the records. I walked slowly through them. Over the course of 8 years, my grandfather provided financial assistance to multiple family members. No reaction. Yet. Then I displayed the totals. Jason's face immediately changed. My father stared at the screen. The audience began whispering. The amounts were staggering. Repeated loans. Repeated bailouts. Repeated rescues. Business failures. Credit card debt. Vehicle payments. Mortgage assistance. Personal loans? Thousands became tens of thousands. Tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands. Every time Jason failed, Grandpa helped. Every time my father asked, Grandpa gave. And according to the records, very little had ever been repaid. I turned toward the witness table. Would either plaintiff like to dispute these documents? Neither spoke. Because they couldn't. The records came directly from the financial institutions. Certified. Verified. Accurate. Then came the final blow. The evidence I had protected until the perfect moment. Emails. Hundreds of them. Most were harmless. Family discussions, estate planning questions, financial concerns. But buried among them were messages neither Jason nor my father expected anyone to find. Messages exchanged between them. Messages discussing Grandpa's will. Messages discussing how much money they expected to inherit. Messages discussing ways to pressure him. The courtroom became absolutely silent. One email appeared on the screen. Then another. Then another. Jason's own words stared back at him. If Grandpa changes his mind, we're screwed. Another. You need to talk to him again. Another. He can't leave that money to Emily. I watched the color drain from my father's face. Watched Jason stare at the screen. Watched Lawson slowly close his eyes. He hadn't known. That much was obvious. Then I displayed the recording. The one piece of evidence I had never wanted to use. Because hearing Grandpa's voice again hurt. Even now. Even after all this time. The recording began. His voice filled the courtroom. Older. Softer. But unmistakably strong. Someone off camera asked him a question about the estate. Then Grandpa answered. If anyone deserves it, Emily does. Silence. She never asked me for anything. The room remained frozen. She never treated me like a bank account. I swallowed hard. Because hearing that still affected me. Even years of military training couldn't stop that. Then came the sentence that ended everything. She loved me before she knew what I owned. No one moved. No one spoke. The recording ended. The silence afterward felt enormous. Judge Bennett looked toward my father. Then toward Jason. Then toward Lawson. Finally, he folded his hands. Counsel. Lawson stood slowly. He looked exhausted, defeated, like a man realizing the battle had already ended. Yes, Your Honor. The judge's voice remained calm, professional, controlled, yet somehow more intimidating than shouting. Do you wish to continue arguing undue influence? Lawson glanced at the evidence, the emails, the financial records, the recordings, the footage. Then he looked at his clients. Neither man could meet his eyes. No, Your Honor. The words landed harder than any verdict, because they came from their own attorney. Jason lowered his head. My father stared blankly at the table, and for the first time in my life, neither of them looked powerful. They looked small. Judge Bennett shifted his attention directly toward my father. His expression hardened. Sir. My father looked up. Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done here? My father opened his mouth. No words came out. For several seconds, he simply stared at the judge, then at me, then back at the evidence, as if he still couldn't understand how everything had slipped away. But the worst part wasn't losing the case. The worst part was realizing that the daughter he had underestimated his entire life was the one who had exposed all of it. And we were not finished yet. The final day of the trial felt strangely quiet, not because the courtroom was empty. It wasn't. Word had spread. More spectators filled the benches than on any previous day. Several attorneys from other courtrooms slipped inside during breaks. Clerks lingered near the back wall longer than necessary. People sensed they were about to witness the ending of something. They just didn't know how dramatic that ending would be. I arrived early again. As I walked into the courtroom, I saw Jason already seated. For the first time since this lawsuit began, he didn't smirk. He didn't make jokes. He didn't even look at me. His confidence had vanished somewhere between Grandpa's recording and the mountain of evidence sitting on the court's desk. My father looked even worse, older, smaller. The past few days seemed to have aged him years. A strange feeling settled over me. Not satisfaction, certainly not happiness. Something closer to sadness. Because despite everything, this was still my father. The man who taught me how to ride a bicycle. The man who used to carry me on his shoulders when I was little. The man who somehow became someone I barely recognized. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Bennett entered. Everyone stood, then sat. The judge reviewed several final documents before speaking. His voice was calm, measured, but final. The kind of voice people use when the decision has already been made. After reviewing the evidence presented, this court finds no basis for the plaintiff's claims of undue influence, coercion, fraud, or incapacity. Jason closed his eyes. My father stared straight ahead. The judge continued. The will of William Carter shall remain fully valid and enforceable. A wave of whispers moved through the room. Then came the next part. The plaintiff's petition is denied in its entirety. Denied. One word. Years of resentment reduced to one word. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, the plaintiffs shall bear responsibility for all applicable court costs associated with this action. Jason looked like someone had punched him. My father simply sat motionless. For most people, that would have been the end. Case closed. Decision entered. Everyone goes home. But there was still one final matter. I stood. Your Honor. Judge Bennett looked toward me. Yes, Ms. Carter. I have one additional request. The room became silent again. Lawson frowned. Jason looked confused. My father suddenly appeared nervous. The judge nodded. Proceed. I walked to the evidence table and picked up another folder. One that had never been discussed publicly. One I had intentionally saved until the end. Because unlike the inheritance dispute, this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. I handed copies to the court, to opposing counsel, to the clerk. Judge Bennett reviewed the first pages, then the second, then the third. His expression changed. What exactly is this? Financial disclosures connected to the estate, Your Honor. The judge kept reading. The room felt frozen. Then he looked up. These assets were not disclosed. No, sir. Jason's head snapped toward my father. What assets? My father said nothing. The judge turned another page, then another. I could see his jaw tighten. Not common for him, which meant the information was serious. Very serious. These records suggest substantial transfers occurred shortly before the estate proceedings began. Yes, Your Honor. And these transfers were never reported. No, sir. Jason looked completely lost now. What is he talking about? Still no answer from Dad. The silence told its own story. Slowly, painfully, Jason began realizing something. The hidden transactions. The missing disclosures. The unexplained withdrawals. His father had kept secrets from everyone, including him. The judge placed the documents on the bench. His gaze settled on my father. Sir, do you wish to explain these records? My father swallowed. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered every year he spent teaching me that my value depended on his approval. Every accomplishment he ignored. Every success he minimized. Every moment he chose Jason over me. Sir, the judge asked again. My father's voice barely emerged. I don't. The answer sounded weak. Hopeless. The judge nodded once. I see. Then he addressed the clerk. I want copies forwarded for further review. The words were careful. Professional. But everyone understood what they meant. Potential investigation.